7:29. I'm going to, everybody, let me have your attention just a moment. I'm just going to give you some housekeeping reminders before our co-president, Wayne, opens up the program. We will be muting the program. We'll be muting all the participants except the speaker during the presentation. And remind yourself at the end to unmute yourself because we'll give you that option for questions and answers. The other thing is we're going to turn off the chat option during the presentation. You can do chat messages during questions and answers, but we prefer not to have it during the presentation. And lastly, because this is a program that we will upload to YouTube, if you choose not to have your picture, however small it might appear, show up on YouTube, just stop your video, okay, during the recording. And that's it. Wayne, it's 7:30, so you may start.
Okay, Tony. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our February program of the Squirrel Hill Historic Society. Once again, we're doing it by Zoom. Things are looking up now with the COVID crisis, but we're not going to go live again until we're absolutely certain we get to it safely. Many of our members are up in years and therefore maybe more vulnerable, but when it gets down to where we'll take a board vote and we'll do what's best for everyone. I noticed there's some new people here, which typically aren't on our at our meetings. We've been here for 20 years, some years, and we have a once a month meeting here, second Tuesday of every month, and it's online, and also a membership that's very inexpensive. It's $15 a month, I mean a year rather. If you're interested, you can go to our website and there'll be an application and you can join. We'd welcome everyone. We're basically governed by a board of directors and some officers. We're a nonprofit. I'm not going to get into the details quite yet, but getting on to our local news here. You may have missed it. The Pittsburgh Tribune published a story last week about Squirrel Hill in their Guide to Pittsburgh series. And it included an interview with our Vice President, Helen Wilson. And it's an interesting read, and I recommend it to anyone. You can find a link to it on the Trib website. Other events locally here. Work continues on the effort to restore the Neil Log House in Frick Park. Our board member, Tony Indovino, is spearheading this project, and he'll be presenting details about it at our June meeting. As far as membership, again, I'd like to mention it is inexpensive. And if you'd like to join the applications online, if you're a member and you haven't renewed yet, we encourage you to do that as soon as possible. Thanks in large part to the effort of our programming coordinator, Todd Miller. We have program topics scheduled for the next 8 months to October. Next month's program on March 8th discusses a book titled Perseverance, One Holocaust Survivor's Journey, which one reviewer described as a testimony of a Holocaust survivor and his daughter to one man's journey in spirit. The author, Lee Goldman Keuchel, will make the presentation. You can find details about this and other future programs on our website. The title of tonight's presentation is The Chinese Laundrymen in Squirrel Hill. It'll be presented by Homestead Jewish historian Tammy Hepps. Tammy's a local historian, focuses on topics regarding American Jewish history, especially in small towns and synagogues. She's best known for a community reconstruction project focusing on the Jewish community in Homestead, PA, which is available at homesteadhebrews.com. Tonight's discussion will examine a traumatic dispersal of Chinese laborers after the Transcontinental Railroad was built, examining their lives as laundrymen as it relates to Squirrel Hill and Homestead. And with that being said, I'd like to pass the torch on to Tammy, and she can start her presentation.
Okay, looks like I'm unmuted. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I first of all want to thank the Okay, let me start over since I was just muted. Wanted to say thank you. Looks like somebody keeps remuting me on the other end. Okay, well, let me try this again. I would like to thank the Squirrel Hill Historical Society for having me back. I remember the talk that I gave a couple years ago because it was one of the last things before COVID. And so here we are 2 years later. Really had hoped to be able to do this in person, but really glad to be able to share this topic with everybody today in whatever format is possible. So as Wayne's intro related, my particular research is usually on Jewish American subjects. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background about how I became interested in this topic, which might seem to you to be quite far afield from what I normally research. So I first stumbled into this topic in probably late 2014 or early 2015, not long after I had begun my research project into Homestead's Jewish community. At that time, I was carefully reviewing the town's newspaper on microfilm, issue by issue, for any stray Jewish name or Jewish business or a Jewish reference. And so you can imagine my surprise when I came across these very early references to Chinese people in Homestead. As I continued my research into Homestead's Jewish community, every time I found a reference to a Chinese person or business or event, I filed it away. And after some years of this, I ended up with quite a collection of newspaper clippings, city directory listings, and census entries. Along the way, I mentioned my discoveries to historians with expertise in Homestead, in Pittsburgh, in steel towns in Western Pennsylvania, and no one knew anything about this thread of history that I was tracing. They seemed as surprised as I had initially been. Last spring, the Atlanta spa shootings and the subsequent attention to anti-Asian hate crimes motivated me to tell the story that was represented by the collection of material I had. As a person who began with only thin knowledge of Chinese American history, I understood from my own years of learning how little the average American knows about the history of Chinese people in the United States, particularly how awful, how intentionally awful their first decades in the United States were. I feel that this is an important story for all of us to know and to grapple with. I want to start by acknowledging some of the inherent problems in having an Ashkenazi Jewish American-born woman relate this history. I don't know the Chinese language. My reading on the relevant Chinese history and culture leaves me with, admittedly, just a basic understanding of the context for the stories that I'm sharing tonight. And most importantly, I know that ultimately these aren't my stories to tell. I'm very grateful that Chinese American genealogist Grant Din helped me with some of the genealogical research and interpretation that I will share tonight. All mistakes and shortcomings, of course, are my own. What I can offer is this. The techniques that I developed to reconstruct the history of Homestead's Jewish community gave me, at the very least, the skills to gather what data survives about these early experiences of Chinese people in our area. I have put years into gathering the data for this community. And tonight I will do my best to tell some of the stories that this data shows to the best of my ability. It will be a one-sided story though, because while I can report to you how non-Chinese people reported on and perceive their Chinese neighbors, I'm not able to tell you the Chinese community stories from their own perspective, both because I've not been able to locate many sources along these lines and because I suspect if there are first-person accounts from the decades I'm primarily covering, they're likely in Chinese. I've taken this story as far as I can take it. And despite those shortcomings, I feel certain that there's a lot here that will be new to many of you. So to start, I'll begin by summarizing how Chinese people came to be in the United States and what their initial experiences were like to provide context for the Western Pennsylvania stories I'll primarily focus on. Before I advance the slide, I want to warn that much of the imagery I will be sharing is incredibly racist. I did not pick these images to shock. I picked these images because they are representative of depictions from this period. So the first wave of Chinese immigrants to the United States began in the 1850s. These early immigrants were primarily impoverished young men attracted by the California gold rush and fleeing the opium wars in China. The majority came from rural villages in the southeastern coastal province of Canton, and in particular, more than half from the county of Toisan. From the beginning, the Chinese in the US were a race apart. They looked different and they dressed different. Their camps at the mines were always separate. As the discovery of gold began to wane, American-born miners turned on foreign miners, and as the most conspicuous foreigners, the Chinese miners bore the brunt of the attacks. At the same time, though, Americans observed that the Chinese miners were extremely hard workers, willing to work for comparatively low wages. From the beginning, Chinese men provided cheap labor in the West. They sent home their earnings to their families back in China. Their reputation for hard work, low wages, and quiet habits led the railroad companies to send recruiters to China to bring back thousands more workers. Chinese laborers were instrumental in completing the Transcontinental Railroad, though they were largely written out of that history. This famous photograph of the moment in 1869 when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed deliberately omitted the Chinese workers who not only made this feat possible, but made it possible ahead of schedule. Chinese workers were 90% of the workforce who made this connection. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, some Chinese people began to travel east and south, anxious to get away from the discrimination and vigilante violence prevalent in the West, which had escalated from protests and legal restrictions to expulsions, massacres, and one of the largest mass lynchings in US history. The most notorious expulsion took place in 1885 in Tacoma, Washington, when all the town's Chinese residents were forced to leave. Its success inspired many imitations. The most notorious massacre took place the same year in Rock Springs, Wyoming territory, when vigilantes massacred at least 28 Chinese miners. The mass lynching I mentioned took place in 1871 in Los Angeles. 20 men and teenagers were killed, mostly by hanging. There was a sundown town that wouldn't let Chinese on the streets at night. There was another town that wouldn't let Chinese on the streets during the daytime, resulting in an entire below-ground town where they lived and worked. All of these examples are just a subset of the generalized violence and intolerance that Chinese people met across the West. As they traveled east and south, some Chinese laborers were hired in large groups for other projects across the US. But for men looking to leave contract labor, the only work available was in areas considered undesirable by white people, like gardening, farming, cooking, domestic service, and laundry. Most especially laundry, because it required minimal capital to get started, minimal English fluency, and it avoided having to work for a white boss. Chinese people first entered the laundry business in the West, filling the void created by the dearth of women on the frontier. Further east, they found cities where crowded housing conditions made it difficult for housewives to do their own washing. Naturally, the Laundrymen's National Association here in the US pushed back against the incursion of Chinese into their profession. This drawing of a laundryman spitting on clothes reflects some of their propaganda against the Chinese laundries. I mean, they literally advertised themselves, the white laundries, with ads like this one. Their efforts were not successful. Laundry quickly became nearly synonymous with Chinese people. Many of the jokes made at the Chinese community's expense focused on their work in this one economic niche that was permitted to them. When we research immigrant groups in the United States, we examine what it takes to build new communities far from home. We examine people, opportunity, and tolerance. As a response to the discomfort Americans felt about their new Chinese neighbors, towns, states, and eventually even the federal government enacted legislation specifically designed to undermine each of these factors, confining the Chinese who were already here, in many cases who were brought here to build the transcontinental railroad, to inescapably bleak lives. In this quick historical overview, I'll focus just on the national legislation which specifically affected Chinese people here in Western Pennsylvania. The first legislation targeted Chinese women. The earliest Chinese women immigrants were stereotyped as sex workers, and so in response, the Page Act of 1875 blocked the immigration of Chinese women to the United States by assuming they were all prostitutes unless proven otherwise. To be fair, the law was written to prohibit immigrants brought for, quote, immoral purposes, but it was enforced primarily against Chinese immigrants. In other words, the law restricted immigration by race without naming race. Scholars believe that the real motive behind the Page Act was to prevent the growth of the Chinese population. As a result of the Page Act, the gender imbalance of the Chinese community in the United States became quite skewed. By 1882, of the 110,000 Chinese people in the United States, just 5% were women. A series of economic crises in the 1870s magnified longstanding fears about the jobs Americans felt that the Chinese immigrants were taking from them, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first law to truly significantly restrict immigration to the United States. It excluded Chinese laborers from the country under a penalty of imprisonment and deportation. It also declared that Chinese immigrants were ineligible for naturalization. The Chinese Exclusion Act, of 1882 was a 10-year ban on Chinese laborers. The Geary Act extended it for another 10 years and added additional restrictions. It required Chinese residents in the United States to carry certificates of residence, lest they be sentenced to hard labor and deportation. 10 years later, in 1902, these restrictions were made permanent. The history that I will relate this evening covers primarily the so-called Exclusion Era, during which Chinese people in the United States were largely unable to build families or communities like other immigrants. And you'll see why in the examples I'll tell. If you're used to heartwarming histories of hardworking immigrant communities flourishing against the odds and the rough conditions of Western Pennsylvania, what you're going to hear tonight will feel shocking. And I'll also note at the outset that if you're thinking, well, but Squirrel Hill has this amazing, thriving Chinese community today, I'll just clarify at the outset for your own personal framing that today's local Chinese community postdates the Exclusion Era and is pretty much discontinuous with what came before. So let's jump in. The violence in the West was the push that sent Chinese people towards our part of the country, and the pull of eastern cities like Pittsburgh and its surrounding industrial district was that there was room for Chinese people to open laundries in fresh territory where there were customers who needed them. After the 1869 completion of the transcontinental railroad, the 1870s were the decade that saw the beginning of Chinese migration from the West Coast into the rest of the United States. This map from 1880 gives a sense of their dispersal. The absolute numbers are probably low, but it is useful enough to compare one region to another. You can see that Pennsylvania had hundreds of Chinese residents in 1880, but most of them were in the Philadelphia area. Although groups of Chinese laborers were hired at large-scale industrial projects across the US, they were not brought to Pennsylvania's mills and mines, as our local industrialists had learned from the experience in the West not to risk the backlash of hiring Chinese people. That's not to say that they didn't hire foreign laborers from other places, as we well know. The one exception in Western Pennsylvania was the Beaver Falls Cutlery Company. In April of 1872, they hired something like 200 to 300 Chinese workers to replace all their previous workers who had asked for a raise. Does this sound familiar? When the Chinese workers arrived in town, and here's a picture of one of them, they were fresh off a roadwork project near New Orleans, and they were greeted by an angry mob. And even after a settlement with the original company workers, the residents of Beaver Falls continually attacked their new Chinese neighbors. Unsurprisingly, all of the Chinese workers left Beaver Falls by the time their contract ended in 1877. The Beaver Falls experiment in the 1870s was an intriguing false start, but the Chinese population in our region did take hold between 1870 and 1880. This table of census numbers shows how the Chinese population grew in our county and the adjacent counties from 1880 on. Scholars believe that these numbers captured only about a third of the Chinese people who were actually here. So you should probably in your head multiply some of these numbers by 3 to get a sense of who was here. One thing that this data does not show is that, again, there were almost no Chinese women in the region in these years. On account of the Chinese Exclusion Act, in fact, the Chinese community in Western Pennsylvania had almost no women for 3/4 of a century. And actually, the situation was worse than that. The Pittsburgh Press observed in 1903, quote, "One thing that is most remarkable about Pittsburgh's Chinatown is that there are no Chinese children. This is easily enough to explain, since in the city there are but 3 Chinese women." For many years, they reported there were no women to be found at all. So the documented Chinese community in Pittsburgh began with 2 Chinese laundrymen in the 1874 City Directory of Pittsburgh and Allegheny. It is not known if any of these men came from Beaver Halls. Most people assume they actually came from the West. The number of Chinese laundries grew steadily from there, and for many decades outstripped white-owned laundries. As this table shows, the Chinese people who came to Pittsburgh in these early decades were mostly laundrymen. And in the mill towns, it was even more extreme than the percentages that you see here. A mill town might have a Chinese restaurant or 2, but it never had a Chinese store. To explain, Chinese restaurants at this time catered mainly to non-Chinese people. Chinese stores catered to Chinese people, and only Pittsburgh's Chinatown could support that. Laundries spread from downtown Pittsburgh and Allegheny City into the eastern parts of Pittsburgh as those neighborhoods became more populated, and at the same time into the mill towns in Western Pennsylvania as Chinese men became aware of that opportunity. The reason behind the spread was not just to attract business everywhere there were prospective customers, but also to minimize competition amongst themselves. The hub for all the Chinese people in Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia was Pittsburgh's Chinatown. It began on Wiley Street in the 1890s, and it moved once before settling on 2nd Avenue between Grant and Ross Street around the turn of the last century. This is where those Chinese stores that I mentioned were concentrated to supply all the Chinese people in the tri-state area with products imported directly from China, things that they missed from home and could get nowhere else. During its peak in the aughts through the 20s, Pittsburgh's Chinatown boasted of having 25 Chinese stores, a number of Chinese restaurants, 2 laundries, a civic organization, a Christian mission, an afternoon Chinese school, a benevolent association, 2 or 3 family associations, 2 rival fraternal organizations, and hundreds of Chinese residents. 2nd Avenue at the 500 block was called Chinese Wall Street because there were a number of firms that transacted banking business in addition to selling provisions and Chinese drugs. So with this regional context that I've summarized, we'll now look at 2 very different Chinese communities in close proximity to each other, the steel mill town of Homestead and the urban residential neighborhood of Squirrel Hill. Neither one ever had significant numbers of Chinese residents in the Exclusion Era. Neither one had a Chinese community that stood on its own. Chinese people in both places looked to Chinatown to fill the void of friendship and culture they could not get at home. But what did they have at home? We'll start with the earlier story, which is in Homestead. Homestead was one of many steel mill towns in Western Pennsylvania. Geographically, it's the closest one to Squirrel Hill. Every mill town in Western Pennsylvania had its own largely self-sufficient economy and therefore its own economic opportunities. The context for the arrival of Chinese people in Homestead is the opening of the steel mill in 1881, which drew many people to Homestead eager to work there. Chinese laundrymen were one of many kinds of businessmen who came to Homestead to provide goods and services to the steelworkers and their families. And so from at least 1883 on, Homestead was never without a Chinese-owned laundry, and Chinese laundries always far outstripped white-run laundries. I want to share with you a quote from an 1899 interview with laundryman Wally to give you a sense of just how much work there was for them in this booming steel mill town. But before I put it on the screen, I want to warn you that the newspaper's presentation of Wally's words is uncomfortably racist. I will pause so that you can read it. By 1900, every significant town in Western Pennsylvania had a handful of Chinese men in their midst, all working as laundrymen. So for those of us who know the story of Eastern European steelworkers in Western Pennsylvania, this history might feel relatable. Young men setting out on their own to support families back home, settling for low-ranking work in industrial centers, enduring nativist prejudice. But what's supposed to happen next is family reunification, community formation, and the slow expansion of opportunity. This is not the story of Chinese people in Homestead. There was no family reunification. There was a reason why they were confined to the long hours and exhausting labor of washing clothes. There were constraints, which we heard about earlier, that kept them all men, mostly unmarried. This is what it meant to be a Chinese man anywhere in the United States during the Exclusion Era. Before I bring up the next slide, I want to warn that it contains racist slurs from the Homestead newspaper. So I do want to stop and reflect on the quote that I just shared on the screen, since there will be more such quotes to come. That quote was a direct transcription of how Wali's speech was presented in the newspaper. The practice of newspapermen in Homestead and really all across the US to mockingly replicate Chinese immigrants' accents was far more pervasive for Chinese immigrants than for any other group. The same newspapermen also consistently relied on slurs like the ones now on your screen, which are all taken from Homestead's newspaper to refer to Chinese people, a level of disrespect that was also uniquely applied to them. Other groups took their turns as the target of the newspaper's disparagement, but never with such unrelenting contempt. I will not read newspaper articles with this kind of language out loud, as I normally do in talks like this one, but I feel it is really important for you to experience these words as they were printed. And so I will continue to pause so that you can read the words on the screen to yourself. I'll warn you in advance that this material continues to be painful to encounter, but the nature of the material is part of the story. So back to it. Homestead appears fairly representative in terms of the possibilities for any Chinese person in any mill town. By my estimation, there were never more than a dozen Chinese people living at Homestead at a time. They were all men. They were all born in China. They never could develop much in the way of family life as other immigrants could. Some did leave behind wives and children when they came to the US, and some came to the US as single men and went home to marry, returning without their new wives. Neither group, whether the ones born here or the ones in China, had any hope of bringing their families over as other immigrants did. Instead, they lived alone or in arrangements matching their employment. I'll start by telling you a little bit about Joe Hua, who was Homestead's longest serving Chinese laundryman and one of the few whose life I could trace over many decades. He was born in China around 1871 and likely immigrated to California as a teenager. In 1899, Homestead's newspaper introduced him as their new Chinese laundryman, at least the fourth since 1883. And here is what they wrote about him. The ad on the left is the first that I found for him. The one in the middle with the curious headline, "No more lying about it, I have got more help, and you can be sure of getting your clothes when promised," suggests he got off to a tough start, and the newspaper's ad man took advantage of his attempt to reset to poke fun at him. He appeared frequently in Homestead's newspaper as an object of mockery. His accented English, his short temper when provoked by children, and his cowardliness when by adults, his susceptibility to being robbed, his alleged opium addiction. All the same, he became an accepted part of the fabric of Homestead's life. The paper called him good and law-abiding. When he brought traditional Chinese New Year's presents to his customers and business associates, including the newspaper staff, they noted, quote, "Mr. Hua well understands and appreciates American habits and has a good business reputation." An 1894 advertisement of his, here on the far right, contains the names of 21 customers, all leading residents of Homestead, who, quote, recommended his work as strictly first class. He was well known in the town. He worked as a laundryman in Homestead from 1899 until well into the 1940s. The census records, which you can see here, along with the town city directory, show that he mostly lived alone. The brother and the cousin living with him were very much the exception. There was another laundryman who I traced living with his son. There was a third who had a ward, since the Exclusion Act permitted students to enter. And there were a few uncle, nephew, or cousin pairings that I noted, but largely the men lived alone or with the people who worked with them. As a side note, it's hard to know what degree the reported relationships were accurate, since Chinese immigrants commonly posed as what's called as paper sons, subverting the Exclusion Act by purchasing fraudulent documentation that named them the blood relatives of American citizens. A study on Chinese people in Pittsburgh suggests that most Chinese in Pittsburgh at this time were paper sons. Another strategy was paper partners, in which a man passed himself off as a merchant, permitted under Exclusion Act, by posing as a partner in an eligible business. So Joe may have returned to China to marry around 1910, but it does not appear he ever had a wife or children in the US. He worked well into his 70s, an age where most other men were enjoying their retirement. I believe he died in late 1948, but I'm honestly not sure. Beyond his laundry, there's very little information about his life. And yet this is one of the richer biographies that I've been able to assemble for a Chinese laundryman in Homestead, and I did try really hard to put together more stories than what I can tell now. American records butchered their names in ways that were inconsistent from record to record. And in fact, many of the Chinese people in this region had very similar names since they came from the same family groups in China. Not for nothing does this one photograph that I have of a Chinese laundry in Homestead, this photograph only came about not because people were interested in laundry, but because they were interested in the big hole in front of it, which was being dug for the Leona Theater. Almost all the Chinese men in Homestead were laundrymen. From 1902, there was usually also a restaurateur running a so-called chop suey joint. Most had saved the money to own their own businesses, and they all lived where they worked. During the Exclusion Era, there were a couple students, as well as an intriguing man named Man Chung, quote, the famous Chinese second baseman of the Homestead Steelworks baseball team, who was the son of rich parents and worked at the steel mill for a couple years in the 19-teens for experience. The Exclusion Act didn't apply to such men and boys. In Homestead, people like that were the exceptions. The social opportunities for Chinese people in Homestead were as confined as the economic. Their regular interactions with their customers showed them how few bothered to look past their pidgin English, pajamas, and pigtails. The Chinese laundrymen ran their own businesses, but were never welcome in any of the town's businessman organizations or businessman-led charitable or patriotic efforts. Joe's Laundry became one of the town's oldest businesses, but it was never honored as such. He became one of the town's longest residents, but again, he was never referenced as such. He never joined a fraternal group. White Christian people in Homestead were not comfortable with any of the town's foreign-born residents, but over time they came to understand that they were there to stay. Although significant efforts were made at times to educate and Americanize Eastern European immigrants, no one bothered with the Chinese. They saw no value in trying to integrate them. Isolated from their neighbors, they could socialize only with other Chinese people. Homestead's Chinese were lucky to be close to Pittsburgh's Chinatown, where a concentration of countrymen and ethnic businesses brought them news from home and ease and familiarity in a wider circle of friends, all from the same region in China. Unwelcome in Homestead's fraternal groups or businessmen's associations, they found Chinese-only versions of these groups in Chinatown. And in Chinatown, businesses stayed open until 2 a.m. to accommodate how late Milltown laundrymen kept their stores open. Chinese New Year was a particular time when Chinese people would gather together. The Homestead newspaper often noted when the holiday came around. During the Depression that followed the Homestead strike, the Homestead newspaper asked Joe Hua about how Chinese people were celebrating their New Year in February of 1893, and this was his answer. Observers associated Chinese people with two pastimes, neither of which white Americans would tolerate. Their go-to substance for unwinding wasn't whiskey, but opium, which led to the country's first drug control legislation against a substance that had previously not perturbed Americans. Similarly, Chinese card and dice games were perceived and prosecuted as gambling. Chinese people's relaxation then always ran the risk of being raided by the police. Even when they gathered just to socialize with each other, they faced accusations of being secretive and clannish. For single men, romantic companionship was hard to come by. Almost no Chinese women were available, and when a white woman took up company with one of them, scandal invariably ensued, as these newspaper headlines reflect. Such romances were rare. Social norms prevented most American women from returning the affections of a Chinese man, and the law found ways to punish those who dared transgress, as these headlines convey. In 1924, a Chinese man who had briefly lived in Homestead killed himself over unrequited love, and this is how the newspaper mocked his sad situation. I explained earlier about the certificates of return. Without residency permits, Chinese men could not obtain a reentry certificate to return to the United States if they ever left. And even those with permits were not assured of reentry because their certificates were not consistently honored. This meant, for example, that one Homestead laundryman could not take his son back home for burial, and another laundryman in a neighboring steel town who went back home to visit his parents was not allowed to return to the US at all. Effectively, the laws locked in even legal immigrants. Finally, social norms within the US not only kept Chinese people apart, but also made them acceptable targets for ongoing abuse from white and Black people alike. In fact, most of the times that Chinese people ended up in the Homestead newspaper was to report an altercation in which they were victimized. Some of these incidents that I have up on the screen give a taste for what their situation was like in the 1890s and 1900s. Add to this incidents like when one laundry was damaged by fire, the Chinese laundrymen whose shop was affected, quote, "These men were made the butt of many jokes and laughs." When the town's constable, to give another example, entered a Chinese restaurant, he tried to leave without paying and arrested the Chinese proprietor when he tried to protest. This is just a subset of what I found in the paper. You can be sure that there was much more that they didn't even cover. This is the worst incident that I found from 1924, when a man struck Li Hua over the head with a blunt instrument. And Li Hua was found an hour later lying in a pool of his own blood. He had a fractured skull, his face was badly beaten and swollen, and he had several cuts on the back of his neck and body. It does appear that he recovered. The Homestead newspaper provides one additional insight. As you've seen, the consistent tone and word choice of the articles likely reflect the general lack of respect that was afforded to Chinese people. Every lone Chinese man was exposed to daily indignities ranging from teasing to physical abuse that we are left only to guess at. The mill towns of Western Pennsylvania may have been fertile ground for Chinese men to earn a livelihood as laundrymen, but in the Exclusion Era, it didn't give them much else. I'm truly sorry that despite my best efforts, I'm mostly describing these men as a group. But there is one man whose story I was able to learn in some more detail. Of the dozens of Chinese men who passed through Homestead, I found exactly one who was able to piece together something of a more rounded life, although it took him until old age to get there. His name was Yi Get Yu, and the difference maker for him was that he was born in 1883 in San Francisco, and he was an American citizen from birth. He came to Homestead at some point before 1915. During his early years in Homestead, he took 2 years towards cementing his future. The first was that he went back to China at age 32 to marry. And this trip may have been his first time in China, and he probably spent much of his adult life saving money for it. He was able to come back to the United States, but his wife, as a woman, was not. The other step that he took was something quite unusual for Chinese men in this region, was that he acquired real estate. In March of 1919, he and Joe Hua together spent $8,400 to purchase property in a prime location, which is where Joe moved his laundry. And then in July of 1919, with the help of a mortgage, Yi alone spent another $3,750 to buy property further down 8th Avenue and opened his own laundry there. A mishap befell his building 5 years after he purchased it. The side of his building collapsed as a result of construction on the neighboring lot. And Yi had to turn away all of his customers. The Pittsburgh Post was happy to coin a headline that poked fun at his situation. By the end of the decade, though, Yi had saved enough money to return to China for a 1 to 2 year stay with his wife and first child. Come 1930, though, he was back living alone in Homestead, once again separated from his wife and now 3 children. In 1931, he made plans for a third trip to China, selling the property he jointly owned with Joe Hua to another Chinese laundryman to raise additional funds for the trip. This time he spent 2.5 years in China, and perhaps it's just as well that he was there for the worst year of the Depression, since China was not terribly affected by it. When he returned in the summer of 1934, as the United States was finally turning the economic corner, he was accompanied by his 19-year-old son, William, who entered the US both as a student and as an American citizen through his father. Despite his older age, William attended Munhall High School for a time. Yi Get Yu then traveled to China for a 4th trip in the fall of 1939, leaving the laundry under William's control, and returned in the spring of 1940 with 2 more sons, Wei Hong, who was 13, and Shek Woon, who was 12. Wei Hong graduated from Munhall High School in 1950 and went on to college. Shek Woon joined his father's laundry. At that point, there were just 3 Chinese laundries in Homestead, and most of Homestead's Chinese residents had left, and even Pittsburgh's Chinatown had substantially shrunk by this point. So there was very little in the way of local Chinese companionship or culture that Yi could offer his sons. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943 when China became an American ally in World War II, although the discriminatory quota system then in place set the number of visas for Chinese immigrants at a near useless 105 per year. Meanwhile, the defeat of Japan in World War II gave way to civil war in China from 1945 to 1949. And the next son, who was then 16, departed Hong Kong alone in December of 1949, just 2 months after the Chinese Communist Revolution closed mainland China. I cannot trace how Yi's wife got out, but by the early 1950s, Yi and his family were gathered together in the United States. And so nearly 4 decades after he arrived in Homestead, Yi Get-yu had the satisfaction of living with his wife and children and even twin granddaughters born in 1955. Of the dozens of Chinese men who passed through Homestead, Yi Get-yu was the only one who fully reunited his family, though it took him until he was almost 70. He lived another 8 or 9 years, dying in 1959 of heart failure. And this story of Yi Get-yu and his family is the best story that I can extract from the surviving traces of Homestead's Chinese residents. The situation in Squirrel Hill was quite different from Homestead. And so before diving in, I want to express gratitude to local historian and cartographer Lauren Winkler, who's one of my favorite people to collaborate with on local history. I want to thank her for undertaking most of the research in this section. And the next set of stories would not be possible without her contributions. But the truth is, there is not much of a Chinese laundry story in Squirrel Hill. First of all, during the Exclusion Era, there were far fewer residents for many of the decades in Squirrel Hill than there were in Homestead, as you can see from this bar graph, which compares their populations. And so part of the context for why the story is different here is that there were simply fewer people. The other context is that Squirrel Hill had far fewer businesses than Homestead for much of its early history. Homestead was a self-sufficient town by the 1880s, and Squirrel Hill residents at the same time depended on merchants outside of the neighborhood during those same decades. The Forbes and Murray business district didn't even get going until around 1910, and as you can see from this graph, it was still pretty slow growth. And so the businesses that arrived in Squirrel Hill came at a time when Chinese people were less of a novelty and so less noticed by the newspaper. And mainstream newspapers weren't quite so racist anymore. So the coverage was different. Squirrel Hill was also never anywhere near as rowdy as a mill town. So as you will see, Chinese laundries arrived in Squirrel Hill much later than in Homestead, and they arrived in a community that was less overtly racist and violent. Lauren found the first documented Chinese residents in Squirrel Hill in the 1920 census. They were college students in a men's dorm. Like Homestead's Man Sheng, who worked in the steel mill, they are part of a different thread of history, the story of elite Chinese people coming to Pittsburgh for education or industrial training. The Chinese Exclusion Act did not apply to them, and they did not intend to stay. The first documented Chinese laundry in Squirrel Hill that we found was in the 1923 city directory, Republic Laundry on Ford Avenue. And by the end of the decade, it was one of 4 Chinese laundries in Squirrel Hill. It's interesting to note that there was one on each of Squirrel Hill's business streets, one on Shady, one on Forbes, one on Mary, one on Forward. At this time, there were no other laundries in Squirrel Hill apart from these 4. And the 1920s were the peak time for Chinese laundries in Pittsburgh, and Squirrel Hill was open territory at this time. One laundry at this time was William Lee's Laundry, which was on Shady from about 1928 to 1932. This famous photograph of the intersection at Forbes and Shady shows his storefront if you look very closely. When he ran the laundry here, he was in his late 30s and early 40s. He had first come to the United States in 1903, but returned to China to marry about a decade later. The record suggests that he had 2 sons, or paper sons, it's unclear, who made it to the United States in the 1920s. Bim Fei, who was born in 1912, and Bim Shem, who was born in 1915. The record suggests that at the height of the Depression, William closed his laundry in Squirrel Hill and moved into Chinatown. His younger son opened a Chinese restaurant. His older son, Bim Fei, actually became quite a success story. He came to the US in 1926 at the age of 14 and began school knowing no English. When he entered high school at Fifth Avenue High School, he was a school senator. He was a school senator since the 9th grade, and he became vice president of the Student Government Association and then was elected president. He also participated in debating and political affairs clubs. He graduated high school with high honors and earned a scholarship to Pitt, where he studied mining engineering, intending to return to China to use his skills there. While he was at Pitt, he was on the committee to create a Chinese room as one of the original 19 nationality rooms in the Cathedral of Learning, and their committee was the first to raise their quota of funds. Bim Fei never made it back to China. While he was still a student at Pitt, war broke out between China and Japan. The old man in Chinatown who could not read English took newspapers to him to translate reports of what was happening back home. He helped to raise funds in the United States to send back to war refugees in China. He became president of the Chinese Institute of Pittsburgh, a student organization through which he continued these efforts. In 1946, he got married in New York City to a Chinese Canadian woman. They had 2 daughters whom they raised in the suburbs of New York City. Ongoing war in China and then the Communist Revolution made it impossible for him to return if he still had intended to. Bim Fei lived a full American life, but if he was a paper son, he left behind quite a lot, more than he had intended. And his father, whether real or on paper, lived a life that was far closer to the Homestead laundrymen's than what Bim Fei was able to achieve. The proprietor of the longest-lived Chinese laundry in Squirrel Hill was named Yi Lim. He was born in San Francisco and first appeared in the Pittsburgh region in the small town of Carnegie, about 5 miles from downtown Pittsburgh. He and a partner ran a Chinese laundry in the town. It seems that he went back to China to marry and start a family in the early teens. His wife came to the US in 1917, and they raised a son and daughter who were born in China, although the son's records suggest that he was a paper son. And they went on to have 6 more children born in Carnegie, to whom they gave patriotic names, as you will soon see. The first evidence for Yi Lim opening a laundry in Squirrel Hill is from the 1924 city directory. His family remained behind in Carnegie, and he claimed Carnegie as his residence, but it's quite likely that the long hours of laundry work kept him away from home for long stretches. It wasn't until all of his children graduated high school that they all made Squirrel Hill their home. This 1923 map does not show a building at this site of Yi Lim's 1924 location, which is where the star is. He followed
his father into the laundry business in Squirrel Hill. Although he was born in China, he
was a
U.S. citizen through his American born.
Okay, I clearly clicked something I did not mean to click. Give me a second here. I did not mean to dictate my notes to you. All right. So the 1923 map doesn't show a building at his location, one of the ways in which he was an early adopter. Another is that he was one of the first people to advertise in the Squirrel Hill News when it opened, when it started publishing, excuse me. And shortly thereafter, one of the issues of the Squirrel Hill News noted that he had a unique exhibit of Chinese vases and artwork in his store, and noted that his store sold tea as well as laundry. Yi Lim's oldest son, Hang Yi, the one who might have been a paper son, followed his father into the laundry business in Squirrel Hill. Although he was born in China, he was a United States citizen through his American-born father. It appears he went back to marry and had a son there, and he was able to visit occasionally, but he and his wife and his oldest son were largely separated for decades. Hang Yi was drafted into the US Army. As a Chinese American with family in China, he was likely enthusiastic to take up arms against Japan, but he did not see overseas ex-service. After the war, his wife and son were able to join him just before the Communist Revolution, and they went on to have 3 more sons in the US. He joined his father in running this family's Squirrel Hill laundry for a short period, and then he set out for himself with a laundry business off 5th Avenue in the Uptown neighborhood. Oldest daughter, Lucille, was born in China and likely came over with her mother as a young girl. She grew up in Carnegie and graduated from high school in 1932. In 1933, at the height of the Depression, another laundry sought to locate 4 doors down from their laundry. She told the zoning board that there was not enough business in the district to support even 1 laundry, but she was not successful. While there's nothing inherently racist in the newspaper's coverage of her family situation, the headlines reflect the curiosity with which her family situation was received. A 19-year-old girl speaking up on behalf of her father and his business. She later became secretary of the University of Pittsburgh Athletic Department for 30 years, and she was a member of the 6th Presbyterian Church, the one at the corner of Forbes and Mary. The 3rd child, George, was named George Washington because he was born on George Washington's birthday. He was 6 feet tall and quite athletic, praised for his talent at basketball and football. He and his brother William, the 4th child in this family, played on the Carnegie High School basketball team together with some success. Like their older brother, both served in World War II, and unlike their older brother, both served overseas. George served for 2 years in the Pacific Theater as a radio gunner in Australia and New Zealand. His marriage to a Korean American woman from Honolulu, who had studied at Pitt, caught the interest of local papers. After the war, they settled in Swissvale. He went on to become Pittsburgh's only Chinese streetcar operator, and she became a medical technician, and they had 3 children. The next 2 children in the family were daughters Martha and Margaret. This newspaper clipping of both of them participating in a Chinese cultural gathering gives some insight into a part of this family's life that we can otherwise only guess at: their participation in the larger Pittsburgh Chinese community. The event in which they're participating was the 42nd Annual Convention for a Chinese Merchants Association, which gathered together 130 merchants from Eastern and Midwestern cities for 10 days, and all of Chinatown was repainted for the occasion. The Lin family were used to being the only Chinese family in Carnegie and later the only Chinese family in Squirrel Hill, but they clearly had an entire life that was centered on the people and shops and cultural centers of Chinatown. It appears that the family had some prominence in the local Chinese community. When a Chinese war hero came to Pittsburgh, he stayed with Yi Lim and his family on Mary, and Martha gave him a tour of Chinatown. The English language newspapers, of course, don't reflect whatever statue Yi Lim held in his own community, so we can only guess from these couple of clippings. The youngest 2 children were brothers James and Herbert Hoover. Herbert, I should note, was born before the Depression tanked his namesake's reputation. I love this picture of James in his high school marching band. And I love this picture of Herbert greeting an Easter chick that someone left at their laundry. But lest you get carried away with all of this Americana, when James registered for the draft for World War II, the registrar was extra sure to note his race. This record reports to what we don't know about this family, what it was like being the only Chinese family in the places they were in, what it was like being the only Chinese kids at school. We don't have the same overtly racist newspaper articles to turn to as we did in Homestead, but that doesn't mean that people weren't racist in more genteel and societally acceptable ways. It appears that both James and Herbert continued to run the family laundry in its 3rd and final location at 2010 Murray until at least the 1950s. Herbert raised his family on Phillips for many years, and his kids went to Alderdice in the 70s. In both Homestead and Squirrel Hill, we find exactly one Chinese laundry family where the next generations were able to find the kind of success that we usually attribute to immigrants. But Yiga Yu and Yi Lim are the exception. Zhou Hua and all the other Chinese laundrymen in Homestead, theirs are the more representative stories of the Exclusion Era. I do want to note that there was also a long-lived Chinese restaurant on Mary called Canton Tea Garden from 1925 until about 1983, so I imagine some of you might remember that. This family, the Chain Clocks, moved to Squirrel Hill in the early 1950s from Point Breeze, and their children were amongst the first Chinese students at Taylor Alderdice starting in the 1940s. There were other short-lived Chinese residents in Squirrel Hill in this period: an engineer, an interpreter for the government, more students, even a Chinese-born girl adopted into an American family. But essentially, in the Exclusion Era, Squirrel Hill was not the right fit for the kinds of Chinese people who were then in the United States. Squirrel Hill was a family-oriented place, and most Chinese men did not have families. Squirrel Hill was a more expensive place, and most Chinese people lived under more modest circumstances. And the employment opportunities that there were in this neighborhood largely did not fit them. Nevertheless, I'll admit I was still surprised that there were not more Chinese laundries in Squirrel Hill, that the 4 in the late 20s were a peak that didn't hold and was never matched. As it turns out, the 1920s were the peak for Chinese laundries in Pittsburgh. Their business was decimated by the Great Depression, and it never recovered. The peak years of the Squirrel Hill Business District and the peak years of Chinese laundries in Pittsburgh really only overlapped for a decade at best. When the Squirrel Hill Business District came back from the Depression, Chinese laundries were sharply declining across Pittsburgh. And so when there came an opportunity for more laundries in Squirrel Hill, there were no longer really any Chinese people interested in opening them. So this leads us to what happened to the Chinese community in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania after the end of the Exclusion Era. So everything Chinese in Pittsburgh was in decline by the 1930s. Laundries were closing and were not replaced. Restaurants too. The Chinese stores in Chinatown were closing, and Chinatown itself had shrunk to less than a block. Its decline was hastened by the construction of the Boulevard of the Allies in the early 1920s, which literally ripped out half of Chinatown. So why did the numbers of the local Chinese community crash so hard? Everywhere across the United States, the Chinese population was in decline because the exclusion policies worked. Families were the exception, not the rule. The many old men who could never establish family lives were dying off, and there was no generation to replace them. The only Chinese communities that continued to thrive were coastal communities like San Francisco and New York City. In our region, job discrimination is also part of the story. The decline of Chinese-owned businesses meant the decline of job opportunities for Chinese workers. Chinese laborers still were not welcome in the mills or the mines. The Chinese community in Squirrel Hill today traces itself to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which did away with the quota system and instituted a preference system that was not tied to national origin, but to considerations like family reunification or special skills. And so within the next 10 years, the Chinese American population in the United States almost doubled and transformed into a community centered on upwardly mobile families whose parents were increasingly educated and working in white-collar jobs. Homestead does not have Chinese residents today. Most of the Chinese laundrymen and the family that there was were long gone when the steel mill went into its death spiral, and the closing of the steel mill in 1986 cemented Homestead as a place that did not fit what the new Chinese community in America was looking for. Yiget-Yu's building became nearly worthless, like most of Homestead's real estate in those difficult years as the steel industry collapsed. The borough tore it down when it fell into disrepair. This is a building that was taken by Yiget-Yu's grandson. This is of the lot where the building used to stand, I should say. But just across the river from Homestead, in our own neighborhood of Squirrel Hill, of course, there is a whole other story. Anyone who walks along Forbes and Murray today can see an amazing array of Chinese businesses that cater to native-born Chinese people, but benefit all of us who live here. And so in this way, our neighborhood has revived aspects of the Chinatown of old, but without the ghettoizing effect, because Squirrel Hill remains a melting pot of people and businesses and cultures in an urban neighborhood that famously is as warm and as livable as it gets, a place that is determined to stamp out hate and stand up for all of our neighbors. The story of Chinese Squirrel Hill today is not my story to tell, but it is a story happening all around me that I marvel at every time I run an errand, because our neighborhood is so far removed from what anybody, Chinese or otherwise, could have ever imagined during the Exclusion Era. As we have seen, the Exclusion Era, by design, undermined each of the preconditions for an immigrant community to flourish in America. Single men were trapped here without hope for family life. They were limited to a very small economic niche. An atmosphere of hate made it hard for them to make friends with their neighbors, or even in some places to be safe in their own neighborhoods. The Exclusion Era ended without any kind of public reckoning with the massive harm that it inflicted. Few recognize that America's first Chinese residents did not live in community the way that we associate with other immigrant groups. I say the Exclusion Era, but really I'm pointing at the people, average people who were driven by fear and hate, who pushed their representatives to pass laws and or just plain treated their neighbors poorly. The Exclusion Era came from the people of that day. In our era, whatever it is now and whatever it will become, our era starts with us, and we can define its character. My formal talk ends here, but I just want to share a couple more slides. First of all, in hopes that someone who is listening is an actual scholar of the Chinese American experience, I'd like to point out that while there are a couple of great studies about the Chinese community in Pittsburgh, there's a real opportunity to tell the story of the Chinese experience in the mill towns. I've done a deep dive into one, but I've seen Chinese presence in all of them. And I think there's a narrative of history here that's really worth telling by somebody who has the skill set to be able to do it properly. And judging by some of the footnotes in these dissertations, I think that there might be Chinese language accounts in China that could be drawn upon. I also want to note that there are more records that can be mined if someone were to undertake this project. There are probate records downtown that show when Chinese laundrymen passed what their property was and how they tried to get their money back to family back in China. And I also want to note that there are likely many immigration records for all of the people that I spoke about available through the National Archives, but due to COVID-related closures, I was not able to explore this route. So hopefully somebody listening can make use of the story that I began to tell today, because I think there's a lot more here. Finally, for everybody who's listening and watching and wants to know more, on the left and the middle are a couple of books that really do a nice job of telling a fuller version of the small stories that I had told today. And I also want to recommend the documentary Far East, Deep South about the experience of a Chinese laundry family in the South. It's a different story because it's a different region, but there are definitely some similarities, and it's really quite well done. And finally, for those who don't know, there are a few physical traces of the original Chinese community in our city. If you go downtown, you can still see in the block 2nd Avenue and around that was Chinatown. You can still see some of the remaining buildings, and you can see for yourself just how the Boulevard of the Allies ripped through. There was a historical marker that was finally approved in early 2021 that I don't believe has gone up yet. Somebody please correct me if I have that wrong, but that will be an important way of noting this neighborhood. And finally, here in our own neighborhood, in Homewood Cemetery, there is a whole section for Chinese burials. And many of the people that I named in this talk are, in fact, buried right in our own neighborhood. So thank you to everybody for listening. And I really appreciate your taking the time to hear and really reflect upon this story. Thank you.
Okay, participants may unmute themselves to ask questions.
I have not a question, but a comment. The Chinese restaurant that was so popular to people in Squirrel Hill happened to be in Homewood on Kelly Street. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but that's where I first had experience with Chinese. We all immigrated to Homewood then. It was very popular.
Thank you for sharing that.
Tammy, did you come across any instances where members of the Jewish community advocated for their Chinese neighbors in some fashion, as Latter-day Jews tend to advocate for disadvantaged groups more than the general population does?
I did not in the decades that I looked at, so we're just talking about the Exclusion Era. That's not to say that it didn't happen, but in the newspaper articles that I looked at, I really didn't get a sense of any particular connection. That said, you can look at the map and see that there was a Chinese laundry that was behind one of the synagogue locations, not the one that is today, the previous one. You can see that their businesses were all intermingled, so clearly they knew each other. What the relationship was like, it's hard to say. I would also say that some of what characterizes the Jewish community today in terms of looking outward and supporting their neighbors was a bit different in some of these earlier decades where they were new immigrants themselves and still getting their footing. But maybe something will turn up.
I remember the Chinese laundry between Beacon and Hobart on that side of the street where I think there's a tailor now, or Pinsker's is there. Did you come across that at all? That was in the 40s, 50s.
So I didn't look too much past the Exclusion Era. So 2010 Mary is where the Yi Lim and his family, where their laundry was at that time. If there were other laundries that opened later in that period, I didn't look too much past, like I said, the Exclusion Era, because I wanted to particularly tell that story.
There's a wonderful book called Shanghai Sisters. Do you know about that?
No.
Talks about San Francisco's development and what you mentioned, the paper children, the paper brothers, how they used to, claim that they were siblings and they would get into the United States.
Yeah, the Chinese history is so much richer on the West Coast. Their numbers were greater there. It was where people came in. I see Grant just turned on his camera. You know what, Grant, this is really your history that you can fill in much better than I can about the Chinese experience in San Francisco. So please, if you want to chime in and add to that, you can do a better job than I can.
Oh no, I just wanted to compliment you for a wonderful presentation. There's so much research in there. It must have been excruciating, all the detail you had to dig into, and because like you say, very few laundry workers ever told their story to anybody, and I'm really amazed. I learned a lot about the two different communities, how they could be so different.
Yeah, the data is not excruciating to me. I mean, my brain works that way. I'll say what's really excruciating, and I mean it when I say it, is that I've spent so much time looking at equivalent records for Jewish people, and they give you that sort of heartwarming feeling of like growth of families and acceptance and opportunity. And as we've seen, those just aren't the stories for Chinese people in that period. And that was what was excruciating, that, other than that, the one or two families that never really in the period that I was looking at took that sort of heartwarming turn where you feel like, okay, here's where America kicks in. Like, here's where the American dream starts happening, despite how difficult everything was before. And so, if I felt compelled to tell us this story, it was just because I honestly couldn't believe, because I came from outside of the community and outside of this material, I couldn't believe just how unremittingly difficult it was. I mean, I imagine for you, you knew what that story was, as you sort of began your own research, but I did not. I was very naive to all of that. And that was the hard part. I mean, even figuring out how to give this talk was hard, because my goodness, you can't read any of this stuff out loud. It's that bad. I mean, I can't think of any other community where you would run into those kinds of challenges. To even
there is a Chinese restaurant on the main street of Homestead. It's been there at least 10 years that I know of. Could be me Lynn or me something.
Yeah, no, they're definitely
near the bridge.
Yeah, there are definitely whole new chapters of history, of Chinese history in both of these.
I don't know whether they were native homesteaders or not.
Yeah, I think a lot of the homestead businesses on 8th Avenue are a newer set of people from those that I've researched. But look, I mean, 8th Avenue is starting to happen, so there's no reason why there wouldn't be an opportunity there for a Chinese restaurant to set up shop and hopefully do well.
The contradiction when you said that the mines encouraged Chinese to immigrate into here for labor, and then when they were finished,
the railroad,
yeah, they like through then that's when the Exclusion Act started. I mean, it's such a contradiction. What did they think they weren't? Where were they supposed to go?
I mean, I think in a case of a lot of the immigrants who were brought over, I mean, let's talk about the Eastern European and Southern European immigrants who were brought to this area. I think the industrialists thought that they could have their cake and eat it too, that they could bring over people and they would do the work and they would keep to themselves and then they would go back. And some did. I mean, the Chinese laborers got stuck here in a way, but they viewed themselves, and I mentioned this in the talk, but a lot of them view themselves as sojourners. Like, they still thought home was China, and they, wanted to go back if they could. Many in the Eastern European community of laborers did go back, but people stayed. People stayed, and they brought their families over, and I don't know that anybody really anticipated that. And there was, in a way, still too much money to make off of their backs to really, stop that, even in the more sort of xenophobic eras where people realized that they were changing the character of America and they hadn't meant to. But look, America is a better place for having this diversity of people, and all of us are better for having a richer set of cultures around us.
Now, I used to go to go ahead. Somebody else.
Sorry, Eric has had his hand up too when you're finished, Marlene.
Right.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that a kind of a similar development in the early 50s when Roberto Clemente, who came from Puerto Rico to play baseball for the Pittsburgh Pirates, his conversations and interviews were frequently printed in the Pidgin dialect in the newspapers. So it was not uncommon for foreigners, of people with accents, to be portrayed as illiterate and uneducated, and to use their own words against them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that example. What I can say from the examples that I've seen in Homestead and in a few other places is that it was far more present in depicting Chinese people in the newspaper than other immigrants. Chinese people never got away with their speech being reflected as just the words that they were saying in these newspaper articles, whereas Eastern European immigrants were sometimes allowed to have their words printed as the words without how they would have, mispronounced by American standards, different letters. So I just want to sort of make that point in terms of like this particular period and context. There was something different that was happening here with the Chinese community than other foreign-born communities.
Tammy, this is Helen. I'm just curious, why did the Chinese immigrants who went back to China, what were the conditions like that they didn't want to stay there and wanted to come back to here where they were having this discrimination against them?
So the particular regions that they came from that I pointed out on that map at the beginning were particularly poor regions. They were initially affected by the Opium Wars in the 1800s. And still, as time went on, those were regions where a lot of people, it was an agricultural region. They had the skills to be laborers, but they weren't necessarily as educated as some of the other Chinese people who were coming as students or to gain industrial training. And so the same as anybody else, people coming from Hungary to work in the steel mill, they came here to make money because it was much easier, even with all these difficult conditions, and they could send it back home and make a real difference financially for their families. My understanding is that there are accounts of whole villages where, the men had kind of cleared out and come to the United States, and the main support of the village was the men working in the United States. So it goes to show, and this is not history that I know well enough to say more than what I'm saying, but it goes to show how difficult that the conditions were in China, that it was better for them to stay here and endure all of that to be able to support their families they didn't much get to see, than to be home and to have, no support necessarily for their families. I'm sorry, I can't tell that part of the story in more detail than that.
Thank you.
I have a little personal story. My husband was a veterinarian, and one of his clients were the Lee family that owned the Third Avenue Chinese restaurant. I don't know who owns it now, but Mr. Lee would bring the dog, and he always brought lunch for my husband. Needless to say, that lunch never made it home. But they were wonderful people and just lovely.
Yeah, look, that's when neighbors get to know each other, and whatever preconceptions they might have about whatever, when they get to know each other, most people are just nice people who want to bring each other lunch.
Hello.
I'll let Wayne chime in if there are any other questions in the chat or hands I can't really see from the controls I have up.
Yeah, I don't see any myself.
Yeah, can I?
Oh, okay.
Charlie McAllister.
Hi, Charlie.
Hey, Tammy. Incredible, as usual, presentation. Especially, it's so heartbreaking, the Exclusionary Act and the lack of family, which really sets this off from everybody else, and is really, I really appreciate your drawing that out and how difficult that made life for folks. Just a couple other comments. One is I think a lot of the problem of going back in the 20s, 30s, and through the end of the 40s was Civil War, Revolution, and Japanese invasion. Those all played a part. The other thing, the second thing would be the way that they portrayed the Chinese talk was very close to how they portrayed Slavic people's talk. I'm thinking particularly the guy, the business or the corporate guy who invented Joe Mugaruch. His parody of Slavic hunky talk is very close to what you had as the transcription of the Chinese talk. And at first I thought, well, that's just the way they do foreigners. But no, I think really it was probably because the Chinese Laundry of Homestead dealt with working class folk who were struggling with Slavic English and mill talk, which was very deeply impacted by a kind of common Slavic tongue for a huge percentage of the people in the mills. And I guess the last thing is that there was a real impact, I think, after the 40s. I know I know a little bit about Amy Ballinger, the union organizer of the laundry workers in the 40s, 50s. She became a first female councilman, as I remember, in the city of Pittsburgh. But what happened then is that institutions, hospitals, and other things became much more important in the laundry, and they become much more industrialized, and then they become organized as part of the CIO in the 40s.
Thank you for adding all of that, especially your comment about Slavic speech is a really interesting insight. I didn't talk much about the white-owned laundries and the more corporate laundries because I don't really want to be an expert on laundries. So there's context there that is worth looking at. And one of those dissertations that I brought up, the 1996 one, actually does deal with a lot of that. You start seeing some of those labor conflicts even in the 30s with some of those wealthier laundry operations. I think because a lot of the Chinese operations were smaller and families, I mean, how much is a son going to strike against his father and get away with it? But yeah, definitely, I think some of that labor organizing is, the history better than I do, but certainly it took hold more, I think, in other parts of the laundry industry and less the particularly Chinese parts of it, just because at least here, the Chinese didn't have any really large scale operations.
Sure. And it was post 1940s. I mean,
yeah,
post World War II. I mean,
yeah, I had to give myself an endpoint somewhere.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. I saw another hand flash by, but I don't see it now, so I'll let Wayne or someone see if there's still a question there.
That Helen.
My question was answered, but Tammy, I did find a picture of Murray Avenue with the laundry on it, which I've emailed you.
Oh,
so you'll see it.
If I turn my phone off to try to give this talk, but now I want to like step away and see if it comes through. Well, that would be great if we found more photographs. Then like I said at the end, my hope was that the talk was a beginning of people trying to explore this. So this is perfect. Let's see if it's going to come in. I'm still listening.
You'll have to look. It's a link to something on historic Pittsburgh, and it's very faint, but I see it. It's actually, if any of you have the Squirrel Hill calendar, it's the and the picture of the Murray Avenue scene. I think it's on the cover, if I remember correctly. It's very, very faint to see, but it's there. So anyway.
Oh, wow. Well, that's perfect. I mean, that's the same way that, was it you or Lauren or Todd who rediscovered the William Lee laundry on that famous photograph of Forbes and Shady? Yeah, now that we have these addresses, we just have to stare at all the photographs and see what's in them.
Right.
Okay, I can't look at this picture on my phone, but I bet it's there. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And 2 participants raised their hands.
Okay.
I don't see who they are, so.
Grant is one of them.
Oh, I was just wondering, Tammy, about that picture you used on the first slide, the Tommy laundry. Did it survive much with that giant hole there that was built for the picture? Do you know much about it?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is it was the other hall next to Ye Get Used that took down his building. As far as I can tell, that laundry did survive in that location. I'll double check my notes after this talk to confirm, but I'm pretty sure that location, it was that's Ann Street over there, that Ann Street location remained consistent for the life of that laundry. And it was one of the longer lived laundries that made it into the 40s. So it must have been, there were smaller buildings there before, and once that giant theater went up, it could not have been a very, sunny and pleasant location. But I do think he was able to hang on to the location, and the building remained intact. So there was that.
Thanks.
And there was a second hand up. I'm not seeing it.
No, I don't see it either. Okay, that's it. I guess if there's no more questions here, I want to thank Tammy again for an excellent presentation. It's something I really didn't know too much about.
Very well researched, Tammy. Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As always.
Wonderful.
Okay.